The high desert of the New Mexico territory paid no mind to men. It was a place of wind, red dust, and silence, stretched tight under a white sky. It was 1882, and the land near the Rio Chama cared only for endurance. Silas Monroe understood this. He lived by its rules. His small cattle spread was pressed against a low mesa, 10 miles north of the dusty grid of San Gabriel. His cabin was adobe, thick-walled and cool, but it held the same emptiness as the canyons. It had been 7 years since his wife, Sarah, had succumbed to the fever, and the silence she left had long since hardened into a way of life. Before that, the war had taken his brother and scraped his own soul raw at Antietam. Now, there was just the work. Silas was a man made of quiet angles. He was known in San Gabriel as a skilled hand, a man whose word was solid, but he was not a man people spoke to easily. He kept his own company. The townsfolk respected his skill with cattle and his steady presence, but they kept their distance, sensing the wall he kept around himself. His life was a rhythm of mending fences, checking the alkaline water of the creek, and watching his small herd of longhorns graze on the sparse grama grass. It was a lonesome life, but it was predictable, and Silas had come to value predictability above all else. He rode into San Gabriel on a Tuesday, the air already thick with heat by 9 in the morning. He needed salt, cartridges, and coffee. He tied his buckskin gelding to the hitching post outside Gable's Mercantile, the leather of his saddle creaking in the quiet. The town felt brittle, baked. Then he heard the shouting. It was Deputy Holt, a man whose authority weighed more than his sense of justice. "Get moving, you half-breed trash!" Silas turned, his movements measured. 2 deputies were hauling a woman through the center of the street, heading for the sheriff's office and the adjoining jail. She was chained, the links heavy and dark against the dust, connecting her iron-bound wrists to the saddle horn of Holt's horse. She stumbled. Her boots, once fine, now split and broken. She was not from here. Her dress was cheap red satin, torn at the shoulder and smeared with grime, the kind of dress worn in a saloon for men's eyes. Her hair was black, thick and tangled with sweat and dirt. The town, slow and sleepy seconds before, had come alive. Faces appeared in windows. Men paused on the boardwalk. Mrs. Gable, the mercantile owner's wife, stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's her," she whispered, loud enough for the street to hear. "That's Diego Calderon's woman." Another man, perched on a barrel outside the saloon, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Heard she was with him when the posse caught him. Heard she's the one who killed him, not the law." "She's a harlot." "Mrs.," Gable declared, her voice sharp with piety. "Nothing but trouble. They say she's half French, half Mexican. Cursed." Silas watched, unmoving. He had no stake in this. It was just more dust, more trouble. He had seen men dragged through towns before. Holt yanked the chain hard. The woman fell to one knee, a dry sob of air forced from her lungs. "I said move!" She pushed herself up, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she did not cry out. She lifted her head, and in that moment, her eyes, dark and desperate, swept the street. They passed the saloon, the fearful faces in the windows, and then they found Silas. They locked with his. Silas had seen dead men. He had seen men dying. He had seen fear. Her eyes held that, but they also held a furious, burning pride that refused to be extinguished. It was a pride that looked at him and dared him to judge her, to pity her, to look away. He saw the fight, and then his gaze dropped to her wrists. The manacles were too tight. The skin beneath was rubbed raw, a dark, bruised purple. Weeping blood into the dust caked on her arms. A cold, familiar stillness settled in Silas's gut. It was the same feeling that had hit him on the bridge at Antietam Creek, the moment just before the world exploded. It was the feeling of something deeply wrong. The deputy shoved her forward, breaking the look. She stumbled on, dragged toward the squat adobe jail. Silas stood there for a full minute, the sun beating on his hat. Then he turned, his face giving nothing away, and walked into the Mercantile. He bought his salt, his cartridges, and his coffee. He nodded to Mr. Gable, who was buzzing with the news. "Can you believe it? Monroe, bringing that kind of filth here? Calderon, good riddance." Silas just nodded, paid his coin, and left. The ride back to his spread was long. The 10 miles of familiar trail felt different, unsettled. The image of those eyes, and the blood on her wrists, stayed with him, superimposed over the landscape. That night, the silence of the cabin was heavier. He cleaned his weapons, ate his beans, and sat on his small porch, watching the sky bleed out its color. He tried to push the woman from his mind. It was not his trouble. He had enough ghosts. He went to his cot, but sleep was thin. He dreamed. He did not dream often, and when he did, it was rarely of anything good. He dreamed of Sarah, not as she was when they married, full of laughter and light. He dreamed of the end, her small, thin hand, burning with fever, the cracked lips, the shallow breaths, the smell of sickness that clung to the damp sheets. He dreamed of his own helplessness, sitting by her bedside, holding a cup of water she could no longer drink. He had fought in a war and seen 1,000 men die, but he could not stop the fever from taking one woman. He woke before dawn, his heart pounding a dull, heavy rhythm. The cabin was cold. He was unsettled, the lingering helplessness from the dream mingling with the sharp, burning image of the woman in chains. The two feelings twisted together, injustice and loss. He did not light the stove for coffee. He pulled his boots on, grabbed his hat, and walked out into the pre-dawn chill. He saddled the gelding. He did not know what he was doing, only that the rhythm of his life had been broken. He rode back to San Gabriel. The town was just stirring. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. He bypassed the mercantile and went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Thorne was at his desk, drinking coffee that looked thick as mud. Thorne was a large man, barrel-chested, who believed the law was whatever he decided it was on any given day. He looked up, surprised to see Silas. "Monroe, early for you." "I'm here about the woman," Silas said. His voice was quiet, flat. "The one Holt brought in." Thorne leaned back, his chair groaning. A flicker of suspicion crossed his face. "Josie LeClaire. What about her? She's poison. Son, mistress to an outlaw. We're just glad Calderon is dead." "What happens to her?" Silas asked, ignoring the judgment. "No trial," Thorne said, taking a loud sip. "She's a vagrant, technically consorting. Got a stack of debts from the saloon in Socorro. We're doing the territory a favor. Wagon's coming this afternoon, taking her up to the Centennial mine. They'll put her to work. She can pay off her debts." Silas knew the Centennial. It was not a mine. It was a grave. Men went there and disappeared. A woman would not last 6 months. They called it debt servitude. Silas called it slavery. "I'll take her," Silas said. Thorne choked on his coffee. He slammed the mug down, brown liquid splashing onto his desk. "You'll what?" "There's an old statute," Silas said, his voice as steady as the mesa. "Territorial law, Section 4, community work placement. A landowner in good standing can take custody of a vagrant for bond, to provide labor." Thorne stared at him. The sheriff was stunned. Then his face hardened into a dark red. "You've lost your mind. You want her? On your spread? Alone?" "Silas, that woman is trouble. They said she'd bring any man who touched her nothing but ruin." "I need a hand," Silas said, his gaze unwavering. "My fences need mending. I'll sign the bond. I'll be responsible for her. The bond ain't cheap. The mine's paying $40 for her." "Then I'll pay $40, Silas said, though he knew it was half of what he had saved for the winter. Thorne glared at him, looking for a crack, for a sign of madness or foolishness. He found only Silas Monroe, looking back at him with the same quiet intensity he gave everything. The sheriff knew Silas. He was not a man who joked, and he was not a man who backed down. And he was, technically, citing the law. "This is a mistake, Monroe." "A damn fool mistake," Thorne growled. but he reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy ledger and an ink pot. "You sign this. She's your problem. She runs. You forfeit the bond and I put out a warrant for you both. She kills you in your sleep. Don't say I didn't warn you." "I'll sign," Silas said. He counted out the money. $40. It took 20 minutes for Thorne to draft the release papers. Silas signed his name. His hand did not shake. Thorne unlocked the cell. The stench hit Silas first: fear, sweat, and waste. Josie LeClaire was huddled in the corner on a filthy straw pallet. When she saw Silas, her eyes widened, first with confusion, then with a deep, bottomless suspicion. She got to her feet, pressing herself against the adobe wall. "Get her out of here," Thorne said, disgusted. Silas stepped into the cell. "Ma'am." She flinched, expecting a blow. He didn't move closer. He just waited, slowly, trembling. She stepped out of the cell. Thorne unlocked her manacles, revealing the raw, chafed skin beneath. He tossed Silas a length of rope. "Tie her hands. My orders, till she's off town land." Silas took the rope, but his motions were gentle as he looped it loosely around her wrists, tying a knot that would hold but not bite. She stared at his hands, her breathing quick and shallow. He let her out. The town was fully awake now. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, a hush fell over the street. Mrs. Gable was there again, frozen, her mouth open. The men at the saloon stopped talking. Every eye in San Gabriel was on Silas Monroe, the quiet widower, as he led the outlaw's harlot to his horse. The stares were a physical weight, scornful, shocked, and hungry. Silas ignored them. He had bought a sturdy, tired mare from the livery while Thorne wrote the papers. He put the reins of the mare in Josie's bound hands, then mounted his own gelding. He didn't look back at the town. He just nudged his horse forward, and the mare followed. The 10 miles back to the ranch were drowned in silence. The only sounds were the plod of hooves on the dry earth and the occasional sigh of the wind. Josie rode slumped, her body swaying with the horse's rhythm, but her head was up. She watched him, her eyes tracking his every move, full of bitterness and suspicion. When they reached his spread, he didn't ride to the cabin. He stopped at the barn. The sun was high and hot. He dismounted and walked to her horse, looking up at her. "You can get down." She hesitated, then slid awkwardly from the saddle, her legs stiff. She stumbled when her feet hit the ground. He reached out an arm to steady her, his hand closing on her elbow. She ripped her arm away from him as if his touch were fire, staggering back. "Don't touch me," she spat, her voice a low rasp. Silas dropped his hand, his face impassive. He untied the rope on her wrists and coiled it. She rubbed her raw skin, looking around at the empty barns, the small cabin, the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the surrounding desert. Her eyes, filled with a lifetime of betrayal, narrowed. "So this is it," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "A different kind of cage. You buy me from the law. Now I'm yours. When do you expect me to start earning my keep, cowboy? Before you eat, or after?" Silas looked at her. He saw the filth, the torn dress, the defiance that was just a shield for her terror. He took a step back, putting space between them. "I don't buy people, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet, but hard as ironwood. "I told the sheriff I needed a hand. You'll work, or you won't." She stared at him, confused. This was not the speech she expected. "What does that mean?" He nodded toward the barn. "You'll sleep in there. There's an empty stall, clean straw, blankets in the tack room. The water pump is by the trough. I'll bring you food from the house." He turned to leave, walking toward his cabin. "Wait," she called out, a note of panic in her voice. "Where am I supposed to go?" Silas stopped. He looked back at her, a tall, lonely figure against the backdrop of the high mesa. "You want to leave? You can leave. The mare is tired, but she'll make it back to town. Or you can head north. See how far you get." He paused, letting the reality of the desert sink in. "But if you stay," he finished. "You work. I'll pay you wages against the bond I paid. When it's paid, you're free to go. And while you're here, I don't let the law take you back." He walked away, leaving her standing in the harsh sunlight. Josie watched him go. his back straight and unforgiving. She looked at the mare. She looked at the open, endless desert stretching in every direction, a dusty ocean that promised only thirst and death. She looked at the barn. She was exhausted, bruised, and starving. She wrapped her arms around herself, wincing as her hands brushed the raw skin of her wrists. With a shuddering breath, she turned and walked into the deep, dark shade of the barn. He brought her a plate of beans and jerky an hour later, leaving it on a barrel just inside the door without a word. That night, a cold wind swept down from the mountains. Silas lay on his cot in the cabin, listening to the wind whistle around the adobe. He was acutely aware of the woman in his barn. 100 feet away, he could feel her presence like a storm cell building on the horizon. The tension between the two small buildings was a living thing, a tightly coiled rope drawn between his isolation and her trouble. The first dawn in the barn was cold. Josie woke stiff, her bones aching from the hard-packed earth and thin straw. The red satin dress was ruined, a mockery in the gray light. She felt the raw chafe of her wrists, the deep ache in her shoulder from where Holt had shoved her. For a long moment, she lay still, listening. She heard the scrape of a boot on stone, the metallic clang of a water pump, the soft nicker of a horse. He was out there, the quiet cowboy. She did not trust him. Men who did favors were just men who hadn't named their price yet. She had learned that lesson at 13, and every year since had only proven it true. He appeared at the barn opening, a dark shape against the bright morning. He didn't enter. He set a tin plate and a steaming mug on an old barrel. "Food," he said, his voice flat. He turned and walked away. She waited until he was gone before she crept forward. The food was simple: biscuits, bacon, and coffee. It was the first real food she'd had in days. She ate it ravenously, hiding in the shadows of the stall, her eyes never leaving the cabin. When he emerged again, he was carrying tools. He walked to the corral. He didn't look at her. Work. He had said she had to work. Fine. She would work. She would work until her hands bled. And she would pay him his $40. And then she would disappear. She stepped out into the sunlight, squinting. "What do you want me to do?" Silas looked up. He judged her saloon dress, her broken boots. "The stalls need mucking. Shovel and barrow are against the wall. Pile it behind the barn." He went back to his own work, mending a bridle. She found the shovel. It was heavier than it looked. The work was disgusting, backbreaking. It was not the delicate, exhausting work of singing for drunks, of smiling until her face cracked, of dodging grasping hands. This was blunt labor. She attacked it with a contained fury, her anger directed at the straw, at Holt, at Calderon, at this silent man who had bought her like livestock. She worked for hours. The sun climbed, beating on her uncovered head. She had no hat. The red satin of her dress grew dark with sweat. By noon, her palms were screaming. 2 blisters had already broken, leaving raw, red patches. Silas brought her a piece of hardtack and a canteen of water. He said nothing about her pace, only looked at her hands. She hid them behind her back. "There's an old pair of Sarah's work clothes in the cabin," he said, "in the chest at the foot of the bed. They'll fit better than that." He left the food and went back to the corral. Josie waited, her pride stinging, but the satin was sticking to her, and the thought of being covered, of being in plain, functional cloth, was a relief so sharp it almost hurt. She darted into the cabin while he was on the far side of the spread, checking his fences. The cabin was 1 room, clean and desperately empty. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and old wool. There was his cot, a simple table, 2 chairs, a cold hearth. She found the chest. Inside, beneath a quilt, were a faded blue cotton shirt and a pair of men's trousers, patched and worn thin at the knees. They were a dead woman's clothes. Josie's hands trembled as she pulled them on, changing quickly, shame and a strange sort of grief mixing inside her. She left the red dress in a heap on the floor. She returned to the barn. The clothes were loose, but they were a shield. The days fell into a harsh rhythm. She woke before dawn, mucked the stalls, fed the few chickens he kept, collected their eggs. She learned to haul water from the pump, her shoulders burning. She was clumsy, terrified of the horses, who seemed to her like giant, unpredictable beasts. Silas put her to work on the fences. She had to dig new post holes in the baked hard earth. The high-altitude sun was merciless. Her skin, used to the gaslight of saloons, turned a painful, dark red. Her lips cracked. The blisters on her hands became a permanent, searing pain, but she never stopped. She worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by a stubbornness that matched the landscape. Silas watched her. He said little. He would ride out for hours, checking his small herd, and return to find her still digging, her movements jerky with exhaustion but unbroken. He saw the grit. It was the same grit he had seen in her eyes in town. He had seen men with half her trouble break down and weep. She just clenched her jaw and lifted the shovel. One evening, he found her by the woodpile, trying to split kindling with a hatchet. Her hands were wrapped in torn strips of cloth from the satin dress, and blood was soaking through. She swung the hatchet wildly, tears of pure frustration streaming down her face. Though she made no sound, he walked over, his shadow falling on her. She froze, her hand tight on the hatchet. He held out a pair of his old, stained leather work gloves. "These will help." She stared at the gloves as if he had offered her a snake. Her chest was heaving. "I don't need your help," she whispered, her voice raw. She saw the offer as a debt, another link in a chain. Silas did not argue. He did not get angry. He simply placed the gloves on top of the woodpile. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice quiet. "Blisters get infected. You can't work. You can't work. You can't pay the bond." He turned and walked back to the cabin, leaving her alone with her pain and her pride. The next morning, when she came out of the barn, she was wearing the gloves. They were ridiculously large, but she had tied them tight at the wrists with bits of string. That night, the tension that had been simmering between them finally boiled over. He was on the porch, as he was most evenings, cleaning his rifle by the light of a single lantern. She had finished her work, had washed her face and hands at the pump. The cold water a shock. She was tired, but the silence of the place was getting under her skin. She could not understand this man. He had not touched her. He had not spoken a kind word. He had not spoken a cruel one. He simply existed, a quiet, watchful presence. She walked out of the growing dark and stood in the yard, 10 feet from his porch. "Are you ever going to ask me?" she demanded. Silas didn't look up. The click of the oiled rag sliding through the barrel was the only sound. "Ask you what?" "You know what? When do I move my things from the barn? When do I start paying the rest of what you think I owe?" Her voice was hard, brittle, a saloon girl's voice. "When do you want me in your bed? Silas!" He stopped. He carefully placed the rifle barrel on his lap. He looked at her. His face was in shadow, but his eyes caught the lantern light. They were still and cold as a high-country creek. "I told you in town," he said, and his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "I don't buy people." He picked up the rag again, but he didn't move. He held her gaze. "And I don't take what's not offered." Josie stared at him. A hot, painful blush flooded her face. This was not the answer she had prepared for. She had her shields ready for a proposition, for a threat, for a leering negotiation. She had no defense for decency. It confused her, angered her. It made her feel small and cheap. She wanted to throw something at him. Instead, she just spun around and retreated to the barn, slamming the heavy door. She sank into the straw, her heart hammering. She was more afraid of him now than she had been before. A week passed. The blisters on her hands calloused over. Her skin darkened to a deep brown. The muscles in her back and shoulders, once soft, grew hard and defined. She learned to swing the axe, to sit the quiet mare without flinching, to meet Silas's gaze with a steady, neutral one of her own. They began to eat supper together, not in the cabin, but outside, by a small fire Silas built. They sat on opposite sides of it, the flames between them. For the first few nights, the silence was absolute. Then, one night, Silas spoke. He was staring into the fire, a tin plate of beans balanced on his knee. "The war changed this place," he said, to the flames more than to her. "Brought a harder kind of man out here." Josie watched him. "You were in it." He nodded. "Just once. Antietam, in Maryland, fought by a creek." He was quiet for a long time. "Lost my brother, Thomas, there. Saw 13,000 men fall in one day. After you see that, this desert feels peaceful." She saw the shadow that passed over his face. It was a ghost, visible in the firelight. She found herself offering a piece of her own. "I grew up in El Paso. My father, he was French, a gambler. He had fine clothes. He left when I was 6. My mother, she didn't last long after that." "How did you start singing?" he asked. Her face hardened. "You do what you have to. I started washing glasses in a saloon when I was 13. Started singing when my voice changed and the owner figured he could sell more whiskey." She looked away from him, back toward the dark barn. "I won't talk about Calderon. Don't ask me." "I wasn't asking," Silas said. He tossed the dregs of his coffee into the dirt. "After the war, I came back. Sarah and we built this place. We were married 3 years. He pointed with his chin toward a small, unmarked rise behind the cabin, where a few stones were piled. "Fever took her. That was 7 years ago." He looked at her, his eyes clear of shadow for a moment. "Just tired. I've lived with ghosts ever since." A new quiet settled between them. It was not the hostile silence of before, nor the empty silence of the desert. It was a shared quiet, a space that held the things they had both lost. The sky changed 2 nights later. The air, usually dry and clear, became heavy, thick, and an oppressive yellow. A strange stillness fell over the ranch. The horses were skittish in the corral, and the air smelled of dust and electricity. "Storm coming," Silas said, scanning the horizon. "A bad one. Get the animals in the barn. Secure the tack." It hit just after sundown. The wind came first, a low moan that built into a howling. Freight train roar, dust, thick as a blanket, blotted out the world. Silas and Josie fought their way from the corral to the barn, the wind tearing at them, sand stinging their faces. They managed to get the door barred just as the full force of the storm hit. "Get to the cabin," Silas yelled over the din. "This barn is old. The roof might not hold." "I'll stay here," she shouted back, her fear of him, of the cabin, still stronger than her fear of the storm. "That's an order," he roared, grabbing her arm. He dragged her out into the screaming wind. They staggered the 100 feet to the cabin, bursting through the door and slamming it shut, bolting it. Instantly, they were in a different world. The cabin was pitch black. The wind outside sounded like a living thing trying to claw its way in. The adobe walls vibrating. Sand poured in through the cracks around the window frame. And then the lightning started. A brilliant, blue-white flash illuminated the room, followed instantly by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the very foundations of the cabin. Josie screamed. It was not a saloon girl's shriek, but a raw, terrified sound. Another flash, another immediate, deafening crack. She scrambled away from Silas, into the furthest corner of the room, by the cold hearth. She collapsed, pulling her knees to her chest, her hands over her ears. Silas, braced against the rattling door, was confused. "It's just lightning. It'll pass." "No," she sobbed, her body trembling violently. "No, no, no." Another flash, and in that split second of light, he saw her face. It was white, her eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond the storm. "It's the dark," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. After Calderon, Thorne kept me in a cellar, in Socorro, before Holt brought me here. It was days, no light, just black. When the storms came, I could hear them, but I couldn't see." She was hyperventilating, pressing herself harder into the wall. "I'm afraid of the dark." Silas stared at her, the truth of it hitting him. This wasn't a spoiled woman. This was a cornered animal. The quiet, walled-off part of him broke. He moved, Not toward her, but to the shelf by his cot. His hand found the matchbox. He struck a match, the small flame battling the shadows. He lit the lantern on the table, the room filled with a low, warm glow. He lit a second one, on the mantel. He lit a third, a small one he kept by the door. The small cabin was suddenly bathed in steady, yellow light, a safe harbor against the raging blackness outside. He turned back to her. Josie had her head up, her hands lowered. She was staring at the lanterns, tears streaming down her face, her breathing ragged. She looked at him, her expression one of utter, profound disbelief. He hadn't mocked her. He hadn't touched her. He had given her light. She rose, stumbling, and crossed the small room. She didn't stop until she collided with his chest, her hands grabbing his shirt, her face burying itself against his collarbone. "They left me in the dark," she whispered, her body shaking apart. Silas stood rigid, his hands at his sides. He had not held another person in 7 years. He was stiff, unused to contact, but he could feel the terror rolling off her, the desperate animal fear. Slowly, he raised his arms and wrapped them around her, his large hands settling on her back. He held her as she wept, his chin resting on the top of her dusty head. After a long time, her sobs quieted. She was still trembling. She pulled her head back, her hands still clutching his shirt, and looked up at him. Her face was a ruin of dust and tears. Her eyes, dark and raw, were full of her past. He saw the saloon, the cellar, the chains. He looked down at her, and the wall he kept around himself, the one built of war and fever and 7 years of ghosts, crumbled to dust. He didn't know who moved first. He lowered his head. She rose on her toes. Their mouths met in a collision. It was not a gentle kiss. It was raw, desperate, and full of pain. It tasted of dust, salt, and a loneliness so deep it had no bottom. It was a kiss of survival, 2 drowning people clinging to the same piece of wreckage. She kissed him with the desperation of a woman who had never been safe, and he kissed her with the starvation of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be alive. They broke apart, breathing hard, their foreheads resting against each other. The storm howled. The pull between them was a physical, aching thing, a current that left them both shaking. The air in the cabin was thick with it, but he remembered his words. "I don't take what's not offered." He took a step back, breaking the contact. His hands felt empty. She looked at him, confused, her lips swollen. Silas cleared his throat, his voice rough. "You take the cot," he said, gesturing to his bed. "I'll take the floor by the door, in case the roof goes." The moment of heat passed, but the air between them was forever changed. The storm blew itself out by morning. The world outside was scoured clean, the air crisp. They emerged from the cabin into a bright, silent world. They did not speak of the kiss. They did not speak of the night. The tension was back, but it was different now. It was sharp, aware. Silas was repairing a section of corral fence damaged by the wind. Josie was helping, holding the rails steady. The work was awkward. Their hands brushed. They both flinched. A rider appeared on the ridge, kicking his horse hard. Silas saw him first. He dropped the hammer and his hand went to his hip. It was Deputy Holt. He reined his horse in, snorting, just yards away. He didn't dismount. He looked down at them, a smug, ugly smile on his face. "Monroe, wasting your time with that fence." "What do you want?" "Holt?" Silas's voice was flat. "Sheriff Thorne wants the woman. Seems there's a new warrant. Came down from Santa Fe. They're convening a grand jury on the Calderon robbery, and they want her as a material witness, or maybe an accomplice. He wants her back in his cell. Now." Josie went pale. She took a step back, her eyes wide with the old terror. "The cellar. I have papers," Silas said. "She's bonded to me. Papers can be changed." Holt sneered. He uncoiled a rope from his saddle. "Thorne said you'd be difficult. He said if you are, I'm to arrest you for interfering." "Come on, Chica. Time to go back to the dark." Silas didn't move. He just looked at Holt, his eyes as empty and cold as the desert sky. He didn't draw his gun. He simply rested his hand on the worn wooden grip. "You're on my land. Holt," Silas said. "Silas." "That's a threat. Monroe." "It's a fact. You're not taking her." Holt's smile faded. He saw the look in Silas's eyes. It was not the look of a quiet rancher. It was the look of a man at Antietam. It was a look that had already made its peace with killing. "You're a fool," Holt spat. "You're protecting trash. Thorne will hear about this. He'll come back, with friends." "He can come," Silas said. "But you're not taking her today. Get off my land." The standoff stretched for a long, silent minute. Holt's hand hovered over his own weapon, but he was one man, and Silas was not bluffing. With a curse, Holt yanked his horse's head around, digging his spurs in. "You'll regret this, Monroe." "She's poison." He galloped away, kicking up dust. Silas watched him go. The dust settled. The silence returned. Josie was shaking. Her hands pressed to her mouth. "He's right. He's right. They'll come back. They'll take this place. They'll kill you. All for me." She looked at him, her eyes desperate. "I have to leave. I told you I was trouble. I bring it everywhere I go." Silas turned. He looked at her, standing there in his dead wife's clothes, her face streaked with clean tear tracks from the night before, her eyes full of a fear he was just beginning to understand. He remembered Thorne's words in the jail. They said she'd bring him trouble. He picked up the hammer from the dirt. He turned back to the fence, testing the post. "Then I've been bored too long," he said. He swung the hammer, and the sound of the blow drove the post firmly into the earth. It was a solid, final sound. Josie stared at his back, her heart pounding a new, unfamiliar rhythm. He had not just protected her. He had chosen her side. Holt's threat poisoned the air, the ranch, once a place of silent, steady rhythm, now felt like a trap, the quiet before a gunshot. Every shadow on the mesa seemed to hold a rifleman. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of Thorne's posse. Silas knew he could not hide forever. He needed supplies, ammunition, mostly, and flour. He rode into San Gabriel 3 days after Holt's visit, his back straight, his rifle in the scabbard on his saddle, his hand never far from the Colt on his hip. The town met him with a new, sharper chill. The men on the boardwalk at the saloon, who used to nod to him, now just stared. They watched him as if he were a ghost, or a fool who had just signed his own death warrant. Mrs. Gable, sweeping the porch of the Mercantile, saw him, sniffed loudly, and went inside. Letting the door slam, he bought his goods from Mr. Gable, who was pale and nervous, refusing to meet his eye. The man counted out the coin, his hands fumbling. "That's a bad road you're on, Silas," he muttered, bagging the flour. "A bad road." "It's my road, Abram," Silas replied, his voice low. He was loading the flour into his saddlebag when Sheriff Thorne stepped out of his office. He did not come alone. Deputy Holt and 2 other men, strangers with hard eyes and holsters tied low, fanned out behind him. Thorne stopped 10 feet from Silas, his hands on his hips, his bulk blocking the sun. "Monroe." Thorne's voice was a low growl, meant for the whole street to hear. "I came to your ranch once, as a courtesy. You spit on it. I'm here to tell you, as the law in this territory, you are harboring a fugitive, a wanted murderer." "She's bonded to me," Silas said, not looking up from his saddle strap. "The bond is void. The new warrant from Santa Fe supersedes it. You turn her over, Silas, and maybe the town overlooks your lapse in judgment. You're a war veteran, a landowner. People here, they used to respect you." Silas finished his knot and turned to face him. His eyes were flat, calm. "You're saying I'll lose my land?" "I'm saying," Thorne said, stepping closer, "that a man who consorts with murderers and half-breed whores tends to find himself without land, without friends, without a future. You're throwing away everything you built, everything Sarah left you, for a piece of saloon trash that'll put a knife in your back for $20. The mention of Sarah's name was a deliberate, cruel twist. Silas felt a cold spike in his chest, but his face did not change. "You said what you came to say. Sheriff, I'm saying you have 24 hours. Thorne snapped, his patience breaking. "One day, you bring her to my jail by noon tomorrow, or I'm coming to get her, and I'll bring enough men to burn that ranch to the ground with you both inside it." Thorne turned, his boots grinding in the dust, and stalked back to his office, his men following like dogs. Silas stood by his horse, the weight of the town's scorn pressing on him. He had been a solitary man, but he had never been an outcast. Now he was. He had chosen. He swung into the saddle and rode out of town, never looking back. He told Josie what Thorne had said. He left nothing out. The threat to the land, the mention of Sarah, the one-day deadline. She received the news standing by the corral, her face pale under her new tan. She did not cry. She just seemed to shrink, the fight draining out of her. "You have to give me to him," she said, her voice a dead whisper. "He'll do it. He'll burn this place. This is your home. It was her home." "It's just dirt and wood," Silas said, pulling his rifle from the scabbard. "It's been empty for 7 years. And now it's not," she cried, her voice breaking. "Don't you see? I'm the trouble. I'm the curse everyone said I was. Let me go. I'll ride out. They'll catch me, and you'll be safe." "No," he said. It was not a word to be argued with. It was a fact, like the mesa. That night, the tension was a living thing. They sat by the fire, but they did not eat. The food grew cold on their plates. They were two people on a small, lighted island, surrounded by a dark ocean of enemies. The 24 hours were ticking away. Josie stared into the flames, her arms wrapped around her knees. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I'm what they say I am. I've been with men for money. I've lied. I've stolen food. I'm not Sarah." Silas looked at her. He saw the woman who had fought him, who had worn his gloves, who had cried in his arms during the storm. He saw the grit and the terror and the desperate, buried pride. "No," he said, his voice rough. "You're not." He paused, searching for the words. He was not a man who spoke of his feelings. "When Sarah died," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "The part of me that felt things, it died, too. I've been walking around this place for 7 years, tending cattle, mending fences. But I was just a ghost, as dead as she was." He looked at her, his eyes catching the firelight. "That day in town, when Holt dragged you, when you looked at me, I felt something, anger. It was the first thing I'd felt since the fever." He looked down at his own calloused hands. "Then you came here, and you fought me, and you fought the work, and you were afraid of the dark. And I'm not a ghost anymore." He spoke the truth into the quiet air, and the admission hung between them, more real than the threat of Thorne. Josie's eyes filled with tears. "You'll lose everything for that? For a feeling?" "I already lost everything a long time ago." He said, This is just wood." She looked at him, really looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw. She saw the man who had fought at Antietam, the man who had lost his brother and his wife, the man who had lived with their ghosts, and she saw the man who had given her light in the dark. She uncurled from her spot and moved across the small circle of firelight. She knelt in the dirt in front of him, between his knees. She took his large, rough hand, the one that had been resting on his thigh, and held it. "Silas," she whispered. He looked down at her, his breathing shallow. He saw the firelight on her skin, the tears on her lashes, the way her lips parted. The kiss from the storm had been desperation. This was something else. This was a choice. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was slow, at first, a question. She answered by pressing closer, her free hand coming up to cup his jaw, her fingers rough from work. The kiss deepened, and the heat that had been simmering for weeks, since the storm, since the morning he'd found her wearing his gloves, finally ignited. It was a raw, aching kiss, full of the things they couldn't say. It was full of his loneliness and her fear. He pulled her onto his lap, his arms circling her waist, holding her as if she were the only real thing in the world. She clung to him, her mouth desperate against his. her body molding to him. There was a faint shame in it, the feeling of two broken people stealing a moment of grace they didn't deserve. But the heat of it, the simple, undeniable, living heat, burned the shame away. He laid her back on the bedroll he'd brought out from the cabin. The firelight danced over their skin as he unbuttoned her shirt, his hands trembling slightly. He had not touched a woman this way in 7 years. She watched his face, her eyes wide, looking for any sign of cruelty, of mere use. She found only a desperate, profound tenderness. His touch was not a taking, it was a discovery. He kissed her throat, her collarbone, the scars on her hands. When they finally came together, it was a collision of need and solace, a fierce, quiet claiming that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with finding an anchor in a storm. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blanket, the fire burning low. The night air was cool, but they were warm, and in the silence. Josie began to weep, not the terrified sobs of the storm, but a slow, heartbroken weeping. Silas tensed, pulling himself up on one elbow. "Josie, did I hurt you?" "No," she choked out, turning her face away from him, toward the dark. "It's just, it isn't real. It's just for tonight. Tomorrow, Thorn comes. It's just a moment. Men, they promise you a moment, and then they leave, or they make you leave." She was used to being temporary. He put his hand on her shoulder, his touch firm, turning her to face him. He made her look at him. "This isn't a moment," he said, his voice raw. "I'm not using you, Josie. I'm not one of them. I don't know what happens tomorrow. I don't know if we'll be alive. But I'm not using you. This is real." She searched his eyes, desperate to believe him. She saw no lie. She saw Antietam. She saw the fever, and she saw herself. His promise, his simple, desperate honesty, unlocked the final door inside her. "They'll kill you for a lie," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "What lie?" She took a deep breath. "Diego Calderon. He wasn't my lover. He was my cousin." Silas stared at her, absorbing this. He said nothing, just waited. "My mother, his mother, they were sisters," Josie said, her voice gaining a small strength from the confession. "His father he was a hard man, full of anger. He taught Diego that the Anglos owed us for land, for blood. When Diego got older, he got wild. He wanted to take back what he thought was his." She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, her back to the fire. "He wasn't a bad man. Silas, not all the way. He was just lost. He was planning to rob the train, the one that carried the army payroll. I heard him boasting. I thought I could stop him. I'd been close to him. When we were young, I thought he would listen to me. I rode out to his camp. I begged him not to do it. I told him they would hang him. We were arguing, fighting, when the posse showed up. Thorne's posse. They didn't shout a warning. They just started shooting. They shot him. He died in my arms." Her voice broke. "I was the only one left. I was holding the gun he'd dropped. Thorne. He recognized me from the saloon in Socorro. It was easy. The outlaw's harlot, his accomplice. He dragged me back to town as a trophy. He pinned the whole robbery, the planned robbery, on me." Silas listened, a cold, hard knot forming in his stomach. It was all a lie, a convenient one. "There's more," he said. It wasn't a question. "Thorne, he hated Diego. He hated his family. He said, when he arrested me, he said he was finishing the job, that Diego's father should have died with the rest of them." The knot in Silas's stomach turned to ice. He knew that story. "During the war," Silas said, his voice flat. "Just after, Thorne led a volunteer militia. They weren't real soldiers. They were scavengers. They found a group of Mexican families hiding in a canyon south of here. Said they were Confederate sympathizers. They weren't. They were just ranchers. Fleeing the war, Thorne's unit. They slaughtered them. Men, women. It was a massacre. They covered it up. Said it was a battle. Diego's father," Josie whispered, her eyes wide with a new horror. "He was the only one who got away. He saw it all. He told Diego. Oh, God. Diego wasn't robbing the train for money. He was going to use the robbery to draw the army, to tell them what Thorne did. And Thorne couldn't let that happen. Silas finished. This isn't about a train robbery. It's about Thorne burying his past, and you're the last person alive who connects him to Diego Calderón. The silence that followed was absolute. It was no longer a question of if Thorne would come. It was a certainty, and he would not come to arrest them. He would come to kill them. We leave, Silas said, standing up, pulling his trousers on. Not tomorrow. Now. Tonight. He moved with a sudden, desperate purpose. He kicked dirt onto the fire, plunging them into near darkness. Pack what you can carry. Food, water, ammunition. We're not running. Josie, we're going to find a way to prove it. Where? She asked, her voice shaking as she dressed. Santa Rosa, she said, her voice firm. You said there was a nun, someone who knew your mother, who knew the story. Sister Angela. At the convent. If she's still alive, she'll know. She knew my mother. She knew about the massacre. Then we ride to Santa Rosa. They saddled the horses in the dark barn. They packed lightly, jerky, hardtack, 2 full canteens, and every cartridge Silas owned. He led the horses out, and they mounted. He didn't look back at the cabin. He didn't look at the small pile of stones where Sarah was buried. He pointed his horse southeast. And they rode. They rode hard for 2 days, pushing the animals, avoiding the main trails, sticking to the arroyos and canyons. They spoke little. The pursuit was a silent presence behind them. On the second night, they stopped on a high, rocky ridge to rest the horses. The air was thin and cold. Silas dismounted and walked to the edge of the ridge, looking back north, the direction they had come. Josie came to stand beside him. What is it? For a long time. He said nothing. He just stared at the dark horizon. Then he pointed. Look. She squinted. Far away, maybe 30 miles. A faint, unnatural glow stained the black sky. It was not the moon. It was too low, too angry, too red. What is that? She whispered, though she already knew. It's the ranch, Silas said. His voice was hollow, devoid of all emotion. Thorne kept his word. He came. She watched as the man beside her seemed to turn to stone, the warmth from the fire, the tenderness from their lovemaking. It all evaporated. The man who stood there now was the man from Antietam, numb, cold, dead. The ghost he said he'd been for 7 years. He had lost his brother. He had lost his wife. And now he had lost the last physical piece of his life. Silas, she said, her voice sharp with a new fear. She was not afraid of Thorne. She was afraid of this, afraid of the emptiness in his eyes. He didn't respond. He just stared at the fire. Silas, look at me! She moved in front of him, grabbing his face with both her hands, forcing his eyes to meet hers. His gaze was distant, looking through her. Don't, she pleaded, her voice breaking. Don't you go numb. Don't you go back to being a ghost. They took the wood. They took the dirt. They didn't take you. I'm still here. You're still here. Look at me. Silas, please. She held his face, her thumbs brushing his cheeks, her own eyes streaming. Slowly, painfully, his gaze focused. He saw her. He saw the tears. He saw the firelight of his burning home reflected in her eyes. The numbness in his chest broke apart. And what rushed in was not grief, but a cold, pure rage. He put his hands over hers, holding them to his face. He burned Sarah's grave, he whispered. We'll make him pay, she whispered back, her voice fierce. We'll make him pay for all of it. He nodded, a single, sharp movement. He was back. They rode on. The loss, the shared anger, forged a new, harder bond between them. They were no longer a rancher and a saloon girl. They were survivors. They found shelter in the ruins of an old Spanish mission, its adobe walls crumbling back to the earth, the bell tower a hollow, broken tooth against the sky. It was hidden in a deep canyon, safe for a few hours. They built a small, smokeless fire in the lee of a broken wall. They were both exhausted, their bodies aching, their souls scraped raw. And here, in the ruins, The full weight of what Silas had lost finally hit him. He wasn't numb. He was in agony. He sat with his back against the adobe, his rifle across his knees, and he finally broke. He didn't make a sound. He just bowed his head, his shoulders shaking, as the loss of his home, the final desecration of his past, washed over him. He was a man with no anchor, no history, nothing but the woman sitting next to him and the gun in his lap. Josie didn't speak. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She had seen men break before, but never like this. Not in this silent, profound way. She understood loss. It was the only thing she had ever truly owned. She simply moved to his side, pressing her shoulder against his, and sat with him in the dark. She put her hand on his, covering it. She was an anchor. After a long time, he lifted his head. His face was ravaged in the firelight. He looked at her, his eyes full of his broken past. She looked back, her own eyes full of a future she'd never dared to want. He leaned in, and this time there was no desperation. There was no fire. There was just a slow, aching trust. He kissed her, and it was a promise made in the rubble. They made love on a blanket spread over the dusty mission floor. It was slow, intimate, almost reverent. It was an act of two people with nothing left, giving each other everything. It was a defiant statement to the world that had tried to destroy them. We are still here, we are still alive, and we are not alone. The journey to Santa Rosa was 100 miles of desperation. They pushed southeast, into a flatter, drier expanse of the territory, where the mesas gave way to sun-baked plains and alkali flats. The horses pushed hard, grew thin. Silas and Josie spoke little. The image of the red glow on the northern horizon burned into both their minds. His ranch was gone. It was ash, floating on the same wind that now chapped their faces. Santa Rosa was not a large town. It was a dusty collection of adobe houses and a single, heat-blasted plaza, huddled around the ruins of a church. The convent, the one Josie remembered from childhood whispers, was not a grand building. It was a long, low adobe structure, its outer walls crumbling. The bell tower a hollow, broken tooth against the sky. Most of it was abandoned. They found a single, tended garden in a small courtyard, shaded by an ancient, gnarled olive tree. An old woman, her back bent like a question mark, was pulling weeds. She wore the simple, faded gray habit of a lay sister. Josie approached her slowly, her boots silent in the soft dirt. Silas hung back, his hand on his rifle, watching the empty, arched doorways. "Sister?" Josie's voice was a dry rasp. The old woman did not look up, her hands, gnarled as the tree roots, still working the soil. Sister Angela, the old nun, paused. She turned, very slowly. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her eyes clouded with cataracts, milky and pale. She was almost blind. "Who asks?" Her voice was thin, like dry leaves. "My name is Josephine Leclerc," Josie said, kneeling in the dirt beside her. My mother was Elena Leclerc. Before that, her name was Elena Fuentes." At the name, the nun's hand clutched her wooden cross. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers finding Josie's face. She touched her cheekbones, her jaw, her hair. "Elena," the nun whispered, her fingers tracing Josie's features. I feel her in your face. I have not heard that name spoken in 30 years. Her milky eyes seemed to look through Josie. "You have your mother's bones, but you have your family's trouble. Why are you here, child? Elena is long gone." "I need to know what happened," Josie said, her voice thick. "I need to know about her, and her sister, Rosa, Diego Calderon's mother." Sister Angela's face hardened. She pulled her hand back. "You speak of the dead. You speak of the massacre." "Yes," Josie said. "I know they were sisters. I know they were hunted. I need to know who hunted them." The old nun looked away, toward the broken bell tower. "The world is full of evil, child, but the worst evil is the one that knows your name, the one that shares your blood." "What do you mean?" Silas asked, his voice low, stepping forward. Sister Angela turned her blind gaze toward his voice. Elena and Rosa. They had a brother, an older brother. Their mother died birthing Rosa, and their father, a good Spanish man, raised them. But the son, Thaddeus, he was from his father's first wife, an American. He was all ambition. He despised his half-sisters. He hated their blood. He hated when they married Mexican men. Josie's blood ran cold. "Thaddeus," she whispered. "He went by his American name. He rose in the ranks of the volunteers during the war. He saw his sisters' new families, their land, as a stain on his ambition. He used the war. He used the law. He led the militia that trapped them in the canyon," the nun said, her voice flat, reciting a history she had clearly protected for decades. "He called it a battle against Confederate spies. I called it murder. He killed his sister's husbands. He killed Rosa. And my mother?" Josie wept. "Elena escaped. With you? You were a baby. She came here to me, terrified. She said her brother was hunting her, that he wanted to erase all trace of his Mexican blood. I gave her money, a new name, Leclerc, from her French father. I sent her to El Paso, told her to disappear. She did not last long without her family. She died of a broken heart, and the fever." Silas stared at the nun. "What was his name? The brother?" Josie already knew. She looked at Silas, her eyes wide with a terrible, clarifying horror. Sister Angela made the sign of the cross. "He is a great man now. I hear, a powerful man. He calls himself Sheriff Thaddeus Thorne." Josie doubled over, a dry sob wrenching from her. Her uncle, the man who had chained her, dragged her, thrown her in a cellar, burned Silas's home, was her mother's brother. He had not just been covering up a massacre. He had been sanitizing his own family tree, murdering his own blood. "Sister," Silas said, his voice urgent, "we need your help. He is still hunting her. He thinks she was with Diego. He wants her dead to finish the job." "Diego?" The nun sighed. "Rosa's boy. He had his father's anger. His father survived the massacre, wounded, but he lived. He told his son the story. That story was a poison. It led him to his death. Thorne killed him, too," Josie said, pushing herself up, her tears turning to a cold fire. "He's still covering his tracks." "I need you to write this down," Silas said to the nun. "What you just told us, all of it. Will you sign it? As a statement?" "I am an old woman," she said, trembling. "He is the law. He is a murderer," Josie countered, grabbing the nun's arm. "He is my uncle, and I will not let him kill me. Please, you are the only one left who knows the truth." Sister Angela saw the fire in the girl. She saw Elena's resolve. She nodded, her face grim. "My hands shake, and my eyes, they are useless, but I will make my mark. You will write the words as I speak them." They went into the crumbling chapel. Silas found a dry inkwell and a pen, and a blank page from an old parish ledger. For an hour, the nun spoke, and Silas, his hand slow and steady, wrote. He documented the names, the dates, the blood connection. When it was done, Sister Angela dipped her thumb in the ink and pressed it firmly to the bottom of the page. They left the convent with the signed statement, a single, powerful piece of paper that could dismantle a man's life. As they rode out of Santa Rosa, the weight of the new truth settled on them. "We have to go north," Silas said, his voice raw. "Colorado, Wyoming. We have the proof. If anyone comes after us, we can use it. But we cannot fight him. Josie, not now. Not like this. He's not just a sheriff. He's a monster." Josie reined in her mare. She looked back at the dusty town, then north, toward the long, empty miles. Then she looked back west, the direction of San Gabriel. "No," she said. "Josie, he just burned my ranch for protecting you. What do you think he'll do now that he knows you're alive and you have this?" Silas held up the folded paper. "This is suicide." "He's my uncle," she said, the word like acid. "He killed my mother. He killed my aunt. He killed his own family and spat on their graves. He took your home. He tried to sell me into slavery." She turned to him, her eyes burning with a pride that was no longer desperate, but forged in iron. "You told me you weren't a ghost anymore. Well, I'm not either. I'm not that girl in the red dress he dragged through the street. I'm Elena's daughter, and I am going back. I am going to confront him." Silas looked at her. He saw the foolishness of it, the raw danger. He also saw that the woman he had pulled from the jail was gone. This woman was unbreakable, and he knew, with a sinking, terrible certainty, that he would not let her go alone. "All right," he said, his voice grim. "We go back, but we do it my way. Under cover of night. We don't ride into town. We find help." The journey back was a hunted, paranoid crawl. They traveled only in the blackest hours, hiding the horses in canyons and thickets during the brutal, hot days. They were low on food, their water tasting of alkali. Silas was tense, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges, his rifle always in his hand. They were 3 days from San Gabriel, picking their way through a moonlit arroyo. When the shot rang out, the sound was flat, a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls. Silas grunted, a sound of air being punched from his lungs, and he slumped forward, clutching his shoulder. "Sniper," he bit out, his voice tight with pain. "Ridge, bounty hunter, get to the rocks." Another shot kicked up dirt by his horse's hooves. Josie screamed. Grabbing his reins, she dragged his horse and hers forward, galloping into a dark cluster of boulders and mesquite at the canyon's bend. She pulled him from the saddle. He fell heavily, his left arm useless. "How many?" she whispered, her hands already tearing his shirt, searching for the wound. "Just one, I think," Silas panted, his face pale in the moonlight. "A straggler. Thorne must have trackers out, not just a posse, men looking for coin." He hissed as her fingers found the hole. It was high on his left shoulder, a bloody, dark mess. "It went through." They heard the bounty hunter's horse up on the ridge, the clatter of a hoof on stone as he looked for them. "We have to wait," Silas whispered, his head leaning back against the rock, his gun in his good right hand. "He'll wait till dawn." They sat in the cold dark for hours. Every sound was a threat. Silas began to shiver, the blood loss and the night chill setting in. Josie pressed her body against his, trying to give him her warmth. Finally, near 4 a.m, they heard the bounty hunter curse, clear in the still air, and the sound of him riding away. He had lost them in the dark, when the first gray light of dawn touched the sky. Josie saw how bad it was. The front and back of his shirt were soaked in blood. His face was ashen, his breathing shallow. "We have to move," she said. They found a shallow cave, barely an overhang, 2 miles deeper into the canyon. She got him off the horse and propped him against the rock wall. She built a tiny, near-smokeless fire from dry mesquite. "My saddlebag," he rasped. "Needle, whiskey." She found his supplies, a small flask of whiskey, a spool of thick thread, and a needle. She tore a strip of cloth from her own shirt. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice shaking. "It already does," he said. He took a long pull from the flask, then handed it to her. "Drink." She did, the fire of it clearing her head. "The knife, clean it in the fire." She held the blade of his skinning knife in the small flame until it glowed. He didn't flinch. He just watched her. "Do it," he said. She pressed the hot knife to the wound to sear the worst of the bleeding. He grunted, his whole body going rigid, his knuckles white on his gun. Then she took the needle. Her hands, calloused from the ranch work, were surprisingly steady as she pushed the needle through his skin. She stitched the wound closed, her movements quick, practiced. He was sweating, his body trembling with the shock, but his eyes never left her face. When she tied the last knot and cut the thread, her own composure broke. The adrenaline fled, and she sank back, her hands shaking. "I thought he'd killed you," she whispered, the tears she'd held back finally falling. "I thought I was going to watch you die." She looked at him, her heart a raw, open wound. I'm terrified. Silas, all my life, anyone I cared for, they've been taken. My mother, Diego, they died. They left me. Her voice broke. And now you. I'm so afraid to love you. I'm terrified of watching you die. Silas reached up with his good hand, his fingers brushing the tears from her cheek. His touch was firm, grounding. Josie, he said, his voice a low rasp. We have both been dying alone for years. Me on that ranch, with my ghosts. You in those saloons, with yours. This is the first time I felt alive since Sarah. If I die tomorrow, at least I died living. He pulled her closer. Don't be afraid of that. She clung to him, her face pressed against his good shoulder, the smell of his sweat, blood, and the dust filling her. They stayed that way for a long time, two broken people holding each other together in a crack in the earth. They waited 2 days, Silas fighting a fever, Josie nursing him with sips of water and the last of their jerky. On the 3rd day, he was weak, but he could stand. We have to go, he said, before he sends more. They rode into the hills above San Gabriel, arriving after midnight. The town was a dark grid of sleeping squares. His arm was in a makeshift sling, his face gaunt. We can't take Thorne alone, Silas said. Not like this. I know a man, Horace McCann. He runs the Territorial Truth. He hates Thorne, but he's a coward. He needs proof. They hid the horses in the shell of a burned-out livery on the edge of town. Silas sent a young Mexican boy he knew from the stables with a message, promising him $1. McCann arrived 20 minutes later, scurrying through the shadows, his ink-stained vest rumpled, his spectacles slipping down his nose. Monroe, are you insane? Thorne has a $50 bounty on you, and double that for the woman. That's why you're going to help us, Silas said, leaning against a charred beam. Josie stepped out of the shadow. Mr. McCann, my name is Josephine LeClaire. She told him everything. She started with the day Holt dragged her into town and ended with the convent in Santa Rosa. She told him Thorne was her uncle. McCann was pale, sweating in the cool night. It's a hell of a story. Ma'am, a hell of a story. But it's your word. You're the accused. He's the sheriff. I have proof, Josie said. She handed him the paper from Sister Angela. He held it up to the sliver of moonlight, his eyes widening as he read the nun's testimony. My God, he whispered. And this, Josie said. She reached into her boot, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper, stained dark at the edges. I took this from my cousin, Diego, after Thorne's posse killed him. He was carrying it. It's a letter he wrote to the territorial governor, naming Thorne, naming the men at the massacre. It also says I was trying to stop him, that I was there to plead with him. McCann took the letter with trembling hands. He read it. This is it, he breathed. This is history. This will ruin him. We need one more thing, Josie said. I need his confession. What? McCann squeaked. You're mad. Silas, you're wounded. Silas himself protested, his good hand gripping his gun. I won't let you. He thinks I'm dead, or in Mexico, Josie said, her voice hard as steel. He'll be in his office. He'll be drinking. He'll be comfortable. I'm going to walk in. You two, she looked at Silas and McCann, will be in the alley, under his window. It's always open on hot nights. You will listen. When you hear him admit it, you come in. You'll be my witnesses. Then, Mr. McCann, you can print your story. Silas hated the plan. It was reckless, but he looked at her face, and he saw a resolve that would not be denied. He nodded. I'll be right outside, the moment he threatens you. I'm coming in. 10 minutes later, Silas and McCann were pressed into the deep, dark alley beside the sheriff's office. The window was open, a square of yellow light cutting the blackness. They could hear the clink of a bottle. Josie walked down the center of the dark street, her boots making no sound in the dust. She stepped up onto the boardwalk and pushed open the door to the sheriff's office. Thorne was there, his feet on his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He saw her, and the glass shattered on the floor. He scrambled to his feet. his hand dropping to his gun. "Ghost," he breathed, his face white. "Hello, Uncle," Josie said, her voice clear and cold. The word hit him harder than a slap. He stared at her, his eyes filling with a dark, reptilian hatred. "You should have stayed dead." "Like my mother, like Elena," Josie said, taking one step closer. "Your sister." She was weak. Thorne snarled, his hand gripping his holster. "She shamed our name, running off with that Mexican filth. Both of them. I cleansed this family. You murdered them," Josie said, her voice rising. "You led the massacre. You killed your sister's families. You killed Diego. You tried to kill me, all to cover your tracks." Thorne laughed, a high, terrible sound. "And I'd do it again. I built this town. I am the law. You think anyone will believe you? A half-breed whore, consorting with an outlaw? I'll finish the job right now, and no one will ever ask." He drew his gun. "Now!" "Silas!" Josie screamed. The door burst open. Silas was there, his right arm steady, his Colt leveled at Thorne's chest. McCann, pale and trembling, was right behind him. "Drop it, Thorne!" Silas commanded, his voice filling the room. McCann heard every word. "It's over." Thorne froze. He saw the wounded cowboy. He saw the terrified newspaperman. He saw the woman he had tried to destroy. He was trapped. His eyes went mad. "It's never over," he hissed. He didn't fire at Silas. He lunged at Josie, grabbing her, yanking her in front of him as a shield. His gun pressed hard against her temple. "Go on, cowboy," he screamed, his face next to hers. "Shoot me. You'll shoot her first." Josie was rigid, the cold metal against her skin. She could smell the whiskey on his breath. She saw Silas's face, a mask of agony. His gun steady but unable to fire. "You should have run, girl," Thorne whispered in her ear. Josie knew Silas wouldn't shoot. She knew she had one chance. With all her strength, she stomped the heel of her boot down onto Thorne's instep. He roared in pain. At the same instant, she sank her teeth into the arm that held the gun. It was just enough. His grip on her loosened for a fraction of a second as he instinctively tried to shove her away. The second she was clear, Silas's gun fired. The explosion was deafening. The room filled with smoke. Thorne stood for a second, his eyes wide with shock. He looked down at the dark, blossoming stain on his chest. He tried to speak. He fell backward, crashing over his desk, and was still. A terrible silence filled the office, broken only by the sound of Josie's ragged breathing. She was on her knees. Silas, his face white, his good arm shaking, slowly lowered his gun. McCann just stared, his mouth open, at the body of the sheriff. The gunshot was a deafening final crack in the small office, followed by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. The room was choked with blue-gray smoke, the acrid smell of burnt powder stinging their nostrils. Thorne lay twisted over his desk, his dead eyes staring at the ceiling. Josie was on her knees, her whole body shaking in the aftermath of the attack, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. Silas stood over her, his right arm extended, the Colt still smoking. His face was a mask of pale, sweating exhaustion, his bad shoulder screaming in protest. Horace McCann, the newspaperman, was pressed against the doorframe, his hands over his mouth, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated horror. He had witnessed a killing. He had heard a confession. The silence was shattered by a shout from the street. "Gunshot! Came from the sheriff's!" Heavy boots pounded on the boardwalk. The door, already splintered by Silas's entry, was kicked wide open. Deputy Holt stood there, his own gun drawn, flanked by two other deputies. They took in the scene in one terrible instant. The dead sheriff, the smoking gun in Silas Monroe's hand, the terrified newspapermen, and the harlot on the floor. Holt's face, already full of suspicion, hardened into a mask of righteous fury. "Drop it, Monroe! Drop it now!" Silas, his strength gone, let the heavy gun fall from his fingers. It thudded onto the wooden floor. "He killed him." One of the deputies breathed, Monroe shot the sheriff. Arrest him, Holt commanded. Stepping over the threshold, he grabbed Silas's good arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed a manacle onto his wrist. The pain from his shoulder wound was so intense Silas nearly blacked out. "No!" Josie scrambled to her feet. "No, you don't understand. He saved me. Thorne grabbed me. He was going to shoot me." "Shut up," Holt snarled, shoving her back against the wall. "You're an accomplice. He's a murderer. That's not true." Horace McCann found his voice, though it was a high, terrified squeak. "I heard it all. I was a witness. Sheriff Thorne confessed. He admitted to the massacre. He admitted to killing Diego Calderon, to hunting her. He's her uncle. He tried to kill her, and Monroe stopped him." Holt paused, his hand on Silas. He looked from the pale, sweating editor to the dead man on the floor. He was confused, but the fact remained: the sheriff was dead, and Silas was the one holding the gun. "That's a hell of a story, McCann," Holt said, his voice low. "You can tell it to the judge. For now, he's under arrest for murder, and she's under arrest for everything else. Get them to the cells." A crowd had gathered in the street, their faces pale in the pre-dawn light. They saw Silas, his arm bloody, being dragged to the jail. They saw Josie, her face streaked with tears and smoke, being shoved into the cell beside his. The town erupted. Word spread like a flash fire. The sheriff was dead. Silas Monroe, the quiet widower, had shot him. By sunrise, San Gabriel was a powder keg. One half of the town, led by Thorne's cronies and the self-righteous, gathered outside the jail, shouting for a rope. "Hang him! He killed the law! Hang the murderer and his whore!" Mrs. Gable was among them, her face pinched with fury. But another, quieter half stood watching. The Mexican families from the poorer quarters, the small ranchers Thorne had bullied, the merchants he'd shaken down for protection money. They stood and watched, their faces grim, waiting. McCann, seeing the mob, ran to his office. He locked the door. He knew he had hours, maybe minutes, before that mob turned on him. With shaking hands, he began to set the type. He worked with a feverish, terrified energy. He was no longer a coward. He was a newspaper man. The territorial truth hit the streets at noon. It was a single sheet, printed on both sides. The headline, in the largest type McCann had, read, "Sheriff Thorne killed in custody battle. Decades of corruption, murder, and blood ties exposed." McCann printed it all. He printed Sister Angela's full, signed testimony, detailing the massacre and Thorne's blood relationship to his victims. He printed Diego Calderon's transcribed letter, the one that named Thorne and cleared Josie. And he printed his own eyewitness account of the final confession in the office, of Thorne grabbing Josie, of Silas firing in her defense. The paper passed from hand to hand. The shouting in the street died, replaced by a low, stunned murmur. People read the story, their faces turning from anger to shock, from shock to a cold, rising fury. The truth was worse than any rumor. Mr. Gable, the mercantile owner, read it twice. He had known Thorne was a hard man. He had not known he was a monster. He looked at his wife, her face still contorted with hate. "Martha, be quiet. We were wrong." He walked to the jail, the paper in his hand. He was joined by 2 other ranchers, then 5 more townsfolk. The mob demanding a hanging evaporated, replaced by a new, larger crowd. "Holt!" Gable shouted, rattling the jail door. "Let him out! Let them both out!" The uproar was now directed at the law itself. Holt, pale and besieged, had a federal marshal telegraphed. A territorial judge, Elias Stone, arrived on the afternoon train. He was a thin, severe man with eyes that had seen everything. He took the newspaper, McCann's sworn statement, the original letter, and the nun's testimony into the sheriff's office, the scene of the crime. He sat at the dead man's desk for an hour. Then he emerged. "Deputy Holt," he said, his voice cutting through the crowd. "Release Mr. Monroe on his own recognizance. There will be a full territorial inquiry in 2 days. Until then, he is a free man." Silas was released. His wound had been crudely bandaged by a deputy, but he was weak. He stumbled out into the blinding sunlight, and the first person he saw was Josie, being led out of the cell next to his. The crowd parted for them. They didn't touch. They just locked eyes. They were alive. They were free. For now. Mr. Gable, his face full of shame, offered them a room at his own home. Mrs. Monroe, Mr. Monroe, my wife. She'll see to your wound. It's the least we can do. 2 days later, the small adobe courthouse was packed. It was not a trial, but an inquiry, and Judge Stone presided. Silas sat in the front row, his arm in a clean sling. The court calls Josephine Leclerc, the bailiff said. Josie walked to the front. She was not the woman who had been dragged into this town. She was clean, wearing a simple gray dress Mrs. Gable had provided. Her hair was clean and tied back. She looked respectable. But her eyes were not the eyes of a respectable townswoman. They were the eyes of a survivor, hard and clear. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore the oath. Miss Leclerc, the judge said, his voice not unkind. There are many who still wish to see Mr. Monroe hang, and many who still believe you are a criminal. This is your chance to tell the territory what happened from the beginning. Josie stood tall. She looked out over the crowd. She saw Holt and his deputies in the front row, their faces like stone. She saw Mrs. Gable, who looked ashamed. She saw Silas, who looked at her with a steady, quiet strength. And she spoke. She told them of El Paso, of her father who left and her mother who died, of the saloon at 13. She told them of Diego, her cousin, and his misplaced rage. She told them of riding to stop him, of the posse's gunfire, of Thorne's words over Diego's body. She told them of the cellar, the darkness, the fear. She told them of Silas paying the bond. She told them of the ranch, of the storm, of the kiss. She told them of Holt's threat. Her voice, clear and strong, filled the room. She told them of the fire, of seeing the glow from 30 miles away. She told them of the convent, of Sister Angela. She told them of Thorne being her uncle. She told them of the bounty hunter, of Silas taking the bullet, of her stitching him up in the dark. And she told them of the office, of the confrontation, of Thorne grabbing her, the gun to her head. He said he would finish the job, she said, her voice never wavering, though tears streamed down her face. He was going to kill me, just as he killed my mother, my aunt, and my cousin. Silas Monroe saved my life. He saved this town from a murderer who wore a badge. She finished. The courtroom was absolutely silent. The only sound was a single sob from the back. The judge read the nun's statement aloud. He read Diego's letter. He looked at the deputies. Deputy Holt, did you know any of this? Holt stood. He was a trapped man. I followed orders. Your Honor, the sheriff. He said she was an accomplice. He lied, the judge said simply. He turned to the packed room. The man who wore this badge, Thaddeus Thorne, was a mass murderer, a family annihilator, and a disgrace. His corruption is a stain on this territory. He looked at Silas. Mr. Monroe, this inquiry finds your actions, though extreme, to be a justifiable act of defense for your own life and the life of Miss Leclerc. You are cleared of all wrongdoing. Then he turned to Josie. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Miss Josephine Leclerc, you have endured more from the law and from this life than any 10 people should. This territory has failed you. All charges, all warrants, all accusations against you are hereby dropped. Forever. You are a free woman. The courtroom exploded. People surged forward, clapping Silas on his good shoulder, reaching out to touch Josie's arm. Josie just stood there, stunned, letting the judge's words wash over her. A free woman. Silas pushed through the crowd. He didn't care about his shoulder. He reached her and put his good arm around her, pulling her against his chest. She buried her face in his shirt, her body finally, letting go. They rode out of San Gabriel the next morning. They had his horse and the mare he had bought for her. The townspeople gave them food, supplies, a new rifle for Silas. Mr. Gable had given him $50. "For the lumber," he'd said, unable to meet his eyes. The ride back to his land was long. They were both hollowed out, scoured clean by the events of the past weeks. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. When they crested the final ridge, they reined in the horses. Below them was not a ranch. It was a graveyard. It was worse than Silas had imagined. The cabin was gone. The barn was gone. The corrals were gone. All that remained was a field of black ash, a few charred, skeletal beams pointing at the sky, and the stone chimney, standing alone like a tombstone. Josie's heart broke for him. Silas dismounted. He walked slowly into the center of the ruin, his boots kicking up gray dust. He stood where his cabin door had been. He looked at the place where his cot had been, where Sarah's chest had been, where they had huddled during the storm. All gone. He walked to the scattered pile of stones that had marked his wife's grave. Thorne's men had not even respected that. He was numb. He had faced the fire, the bullet, the jail. But this was the end of his world. Josie stayed by the horses, her throat tight, letting him have his grief. He stood there for a full minute, utterly still. Then he heard it. A faint thump, thump, thump from beneath the small, warped boards of the porch, the only part of the structure that hadn't fully burned. It was followed by a weak, hopeful whimper. Silas froze. "Bandit?" he whispered. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and pulled at a blackened board with his good hand. It came away. A thin, soot-covered, half-starved hound dog crawled out from the darkness. It was Bandit, his old dog, who he'd thought had burned with the barn. The dog had somehow hidden under the porch, surviving for days on nothing. Bandit whined, a sound of pure joy, and collapsed against Silas's chest, licking his face, his tail thumping weakly in the ash. Silas, the man who had not cried for his wife, his brother, or his home, wrapped his good arm around the dog and bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. He held the one living piece of his past, and the wall he had kept up for a decade finally crumbled to dust. Josie walked over and knelt in the ash beside him. She didn't speak. She just put her hand on his shaking back, her other hand stroking the dog's filthy head. They sat there for a long time, the three of them, a man, a woman, and a dog, in the absolute center of the ruin. "What do we do now, Silas?" Josie asked, her voice soft. He looked up. His face was streaked with ash and tears. He looked at the devastation. He had no home. He had no money. He had nothing. "I don't know," he said, his voice hollow. Josie looked down at her own hands. They were calloused from the ranch work. The blisters long since healed. They were strong. They had stitched a man's shoulder. They had fought for her life. "I want to build something," she said, her voice quiet but fierce, catching him by surprise. He looked at her. "I don't mean just this, not just putting back what he burned." She scooped up a handful of the ash, mixed with the dirt. "I've spent my whole life in rented rooms, in barns, in cellars. I've never had a place. I want to build something real, with my own hands, something they can't burn down, something they can't take away." Silas looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the soot on her cheek, the strength in her jaw. He saw the woman who had faced a courtroom and won. He saw the woman who had brought him back from the dead in that canyon. He wasn't seeing the harlot. He wasn't seeing the trouble. He was seeing his entire future. He nodded, just once. "All right," he said. The work began the next day. It was brutal. They had no money for new lumber. They salvaged. They dragged charred beams from the wreckage, testing them for strength, scraping away the black. They collected the river stones that had been scattered to rebuild the foundation. Silas, with his arm in a sling, taught Josie how to mix adobe, the thick, heavy mud and straw that would form the new walls. He was a teacher. She was a tireless student. His left arm was useless, so she became his left arm. She learned to swing the hammer, to set the posts, to lay the mud bricks, one heavy, perfect brick at a time. He taught her how to sight a straight line. He also taught her to ride, truly ride. Not just sit on the mare while he led the way. He taught her to feel the horse's rhythm, to use her legs, to guide the animal with trust, not fear. It was a lesson in partnership. They worked from sunup to sundown. They fell onto their bedrolls at night, their bodies aching, too tired to speak. They grieved together, in silence. When they found a melted piece of glass that had been Sarah's, they laughed, a real barking laugh from Silas. When Josie slipped and fell backward into the mud pit, they were building something new, not his old cabin. This one was smaller, stronger. It faced the east, to catch the morning sun. One night, weeks later, they sat by their small fire, the half-built walls of their new home rising around them like a promise. Bandit, now fat and clean, snored at their feet. Silas's shoulder was healing, the sling gone. Josie looked at the structure, then at her own hands, cracked and stained with mud, but strong. "I never thought I'd get to live like this," she whispered, her voice thick. "I never thought I'd be allowed to be this tired, this clean." Silas looked at her. The firelight caught the planes of her face, the new strength in her. He thought of the man he had been, the ghost, walking his empty rooms. "I didn't think I'd feel alive again," he answered, his voice rough. "Not really." She met his gaze. The space between them was no longer filled with tension, or fear, or grief. It was filled with the shared sweat of their labor, with the quiet understanding of two people who had pulled each other from the wreckage. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. They kissed, and it was not the desperate, raw kiss of the storm, nor the aching, fearful kiss of the mission. It was slow, and deep, and sure. It tasted of wood smoke, and dust, and the earth. He pulled her down onto the blanket, under the vast, silver spray of the stars. They made love on the ground they had claimed, beside the home they were building with their own hands. It was earthy, and raw, and real. It was not the taking of a saloon girl, nor the solace of a widower. It was the love of two builders, two partners, two survivors. Finally, truly, free. The rebuilding was a kind of prayer, spoken in sweat and adobe. They had cleared the ash, dug new foundations from the wounded earth, and begun to raise walls. The stones, washed clean of soot, were set back in place. The salvaged beams, scarred but strong, formed a new skeleton. It was not his old house. It was theirs. Autumn was turning. The days still warm, but the nights carrying a sharp, cold edge. A new sky was building in the west, a deep, bruised purple that swallowed the horizon. It had been building for 2 days. "Storm," Silas said, his voice flat. He was on the new roof frame, laying the last of the planking before they could seal it. His shoulder, though healed, ached in the changing pressure. "A bad one. We need to get the tools inside." Inside was still a generous term. The house had 3 solid walls of fresh adobe and a half-finished roof. The front was still open to the elements. Josie nodded, her face grim. She was not the same woman who had cowered during the dust storm. That woman had been afraid of the dark. This woman was afraid of losing what she had built. She helped him drag the heavy canvas tarp over the open front, securing it to the posts with thick rope. They moved the horses into the lee of the canyon, and Bandit, whining, pressed into the back corner of the new structure. The storm hit not with rain, but with a roar of wind. It came down the high desert like a freight train, a solid wall of air that slammed into the new house. The canvas tarp snapped taut, straining the ropes. "It's not going to hold." Silas yelled over the scream of the wind. He threw his weight against the main post, feeling the entire structure shudder. Josie was right beside him, her shoulder pressed to the wood, adding her own strength. Then the rain came. Not a drizzle, but a deluge, thick, cold, and horizontal. It found every crack. The roof, not yet tarred, began to drip, then leak, then pour. Lightning split the sky, one brilliant flash after another, and the thunder was not a rumble, but a physical explosion that shook the ground. Josie flinched at the first crack, a reflex from the cellar, but she didn't crumble. She just pressed harder against the post. "The roof!" Silas shouted, pointing up. A section of the planking, where he hadn't finished nailing, was lifting in the gusts. "If it goes, it'll pull the wall." He scrambled onto the workbench, his good arm reaching, trying to grab the flapping board. He couldn't. "Here!" Josie shoved the hammer into his hand and scrambled up beside him. She braced his legs with her body, acting as his anchor, while he, with his one good arm, swung the hammer, driving the nails home in the middle of the blinding, screaming storm. The wind tore at her hair, whipping it across his face. The rain plastered her clothes to her body, but she held him steady. He finished, and they collapsed back to the muddy floor. They were soaked, cold, and breathing hard. "Will it hold?" she asked, her voice trembling, but not with fear, with exertion. "It'll hold," he said. They huddled together in the back corner. Bandit pressed between them, sharing warmth. The storm raged for hours. It was a biblical, cleansing violence, a testing of their new foundation. They didn't talk. They just held each other, listening to the thunder crack and the wind howl, feeling the vibrations in the new walls. They were not two separate, wounded people. They were a single, stubborn unit, an anchor against the chaos. When the dawn finally came, the silence was almost as loud as the storm had been. Silas unlashed the canvas. He and Josie stepped out onto what felt like a new, raw earth. The world was washed clean. The air was so crisp it hurt to breathe, sharp with the scent of ozone and wet greasewood. The sky was a high, piercing blue, not a wisp of cloud remaining. The dust that had perpetually coated the landscape, the ash of his old life, was gone, washed away, soaked into the dark, hungry soil. They looked at their house. It was battered. The front was a sea of mud, but it was standing. The walls were sound. The roof was still there. It had held. Josie looked at the clean horizon, a symbolic fresh start. She took a deep breath, the first clean breath of her life, and smiled. "Well," she said, picking a piece of wet leaf from her hair, "the floor is ruined." Silas looked at her, soaked and covered in mud, and he laughed. It was a real, unguarded sound. "We didn't have a floor yet, Josie. Then we'd better build one," she said. 2 days later, the mail rider came. It was Silas Jessup, a young man who had always avoided Silas Monroe's ranch. This time, he rode right up to the half-built house, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. "Mr. Monroe, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat to Josie, his face turning red. "Got the mail, and these." He handed over a small stack of letters and 2 newspapers. One was Horace McCann's Territorial Truth. The other was the Santa Fe New Mexican. McCann's paper had their story on the front page, but the Santa Fe paper had it, too. McCann's reporting had been picked up, reprinted, and spread across the territory. They sat on a salvaged bench in the new sunlight, and Josie read the words that defined her. The New Mexican was more sensational. It called her Thorne's Avenging Angel in one paragraph and the Calderon Harlot in the next. It praised her courage in the courtroom but lingered on the sordid details of her life in the saloons. It speculated on her relationship with Silas, painting him as both a noble protector and a bewitched fool. Some stories called her a hero, a symbol of justice rising from the dust. Others, clearly penned by Thorne's allies, called her a liar, a seductress, a half-breed opportunist who had manipulated a good man into murder. Josie read every word, her face pale. She saw her life, and her mother's life, twisted into public spectacle. She saw the word whore printed next to her name. In the past, this would have destroyed her. It would have sent her back to the barn, back into the shadows, confirming every terrible thing she had ever believed about herself. Silas watched her, his hand clenched, his jaw tight. He was ready for the tears, for the anger. He was ready to ride to Santa Fe and break a man's jaw. But Josie just finished the last column, her expression unreadable. She folded the paper very precisely and placed it on the bench. She looked at her hands, which were caked with drying adobe mud. "They spelled my name wrong," she said, her voice quiet. "In the Santa Fe one, they spelled it with a Y." She stood up, picked up her trowel, and went back to the wall she had been mixing mud for. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. The words on the page, the names they called her, they were just noise. They were the wind from the storm. And she was the wall. She knew who she was. She was not a harlot or an angel. She was a builder. Her identity was not in their ink. It was in the mud on her hands, in the house rising behind her. Silas watched her for a long minute. The quiet, profound respect he felt for her was so strong it ached in his chest. He went back to his own work, planning a new board for the window frame. The newspaper stories changed things. A few days later, a wagon appeared on the ridge. Silas's hand went to his gun. But it wasn't a threat. It was Mr. Romero, the father of the stable boy, accompanied by 2 other men from the Mexican community in San Gabriel. Their faces were solemn. They pulled their wagon up, and Mr. Romero stepped down, holding his hat in his hands. "Senor Monroe, Senora," he said, bowing his head to Josie. We did not believe," he said in quiet, formal Spanish, looking at Josie. "We did not know you were one of our own, that you were Elena's daughter. We are ashamed that we did not help you. You couldn't have known." Josie replied in the same language, her own Spanish rusty but steady. "Thorne was powerful." "He was," Romero agreed. "But he is gone, and you are here. We have little, but Thorne's boot was on our necks, too. You lifted it." He turned to the wagon. He and the other men began to unload what they had brought. It was not much. 12 fresh adobe bricks, dried in their own yards. A sack of blue cornmeal. 3 chickens, clucking in a wooden crate. Josie's eyes filled with tears. She had never been given a gift that did not have a price. "We cannot pay you for this," Silas said, stepping forward. "This is not for pay," Romero said, his voice firm. "This is for family. We will help you build." They were the first. They were not the last. A few days later, the widow of a rancher Thorne had cheated out of water rights came, bringing a small box of vegetable seeds. Mr. Gable arrived, his face still etched with shame, and brought 3 kegs of nails, a new window, and 2 rifles. "My wife, she is praying for you," he mumbled, which was his version of an apology. Even Horace McCann rode out, bringing a crate of books. "Every house needs reading," he said, puffing, proud of his own part in the story. A small, quiet community began to form around the ashes. They were not building a ranch. They were building a refuge. The house was finished by the time the first snows dusted the high peaks. The roof was tarred. The floor was laid. The window was set. It was small. Just 1 large room and a small bedroom. But it was solid. It was theirs. They were on the new porch, a small, 3-plank square Silas had just finished. It was evening. The air was cold and clean. They were exhausted. Streaks of dirt on their faces. The smell of fresh-cut pine on their clothes. Silas was driving the last peg into the railing. He tested it with his weight, then nodded, satisfied. He looked at the hammer in his hand. It was his father's hammer, the handle worn smooth and dark, the head scarred. It was one of the few tools he had found in the wreckage, protected by a metal box. He looked at Josie. She was sitting on the top step, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the sky turn pink. She looked at peace. Her hair was tied back in a practical knot, and she looked strong. She looked like she belonged. He sat down beside her, the hammer resting on his knee. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the satisfaction of a long day's work. "It's done," she said quietly. "Almost," he said. He held the hammer out to her, handle first. She looked at it, confused. "My arm is too tired to work any more today. Silas." "I know," he said, his voice rough. He cleared his throat. This was my father's. He built his first house with it. I built my first one with it. Now, We've built this one. He nudged her hand with the handle. Help me finish this place, Josie. She still didn't understand. She looked from the hammer to his face. His eyes were steady, serious, and full of a quiet, desperate hope. Stay, he said. Don't just stay until the winter. Don't just stay as a partner. Stay as my wife. Josie's breath caught. A proposal. She had imagined proposals 1,000 times as a young, foolish girl in El Paso. They had involved fancy dresses, moonlight, pretty words. Not a hammer, not two people covered in dirt. This was better. This was real. He wasn't offering her a ring, a symbol of possession. He was offering her a tool, a symbol of partnership. He wasn't asking her to be his, he was asking her to build with him. She looked at his calloused hand, at the scarred, solid hammer. She looked at his steady, quiet eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll stay. He didn't kiss her. Not right away. He just let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding since the day he saw her in chains. He put his good arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat on the porch of the house they had built and watched the first stars appear. The final scene was weeks later. It was a cold, clear night. The house was warm, a thread of smoke rising from the new stone chimney. Inside, a fire crackled. Bandits snored on the new hearth. On the small porch, Silas sat on the top step, a whetstone in his hand, sharpening the blade of an axe. The rhythmic, scraping sound was peaceful, a sound of preparation, of a life at work. Josie came out, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She sat on the railing, her back against the post. Her hair was loose, clean and dark in the moonlight, blowing gently in the high desert wind. She looked at Silas, at his profile in the dark, the concentration on his face. He was no longer a ghost. The lines of grief were still there, but they were softer. He was a man at peace in his own home. She looked out at the vast, silent, starlit land. It was not a prison. It was a canvas. And softly, so softly the wind almost took the words, she began to sing. It was not a saloon song, loud and brassy. It was a Spanish lullaby, one her mother had sung to her, a tune she had buried for 30 years. It was a song of lost homes, of safety, of the moon watching over a sleeping child. It was the sound of her heritage, the blood Thorne had tried to erase, and it was beautiful. Silas stopped his work. The whetstone paused. He listened, watching her. They had built something. It was not perfect. It was small. The walls were uneven in places. The floor creaked, but it was honest. It was sacred. It was theirs. Josie finished her song, the last note fading into the wind. She looked at him, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. They were right, she said, her voice soft. The townsfolk, Mrs., Gable, they all said I'd bring you trouble. Silas looked at the home they had built. He looked at the woman who had fought a storm, a sheriff, and his own ghosts. And one. He put the axe down. He smiled back, a slow, warm smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. Best damn trouble I ever had. Thank you for listening to this story. I truly hope it brought you a piece of the high desert. If you enjoyed it, please comment and let me know where you are listening from. I love hearing how far these stories travel. And if you want more tales from the Old West, please subscribe to From Wild West right here. I'd love to know your thoughts on Silas and Josie's journey, so please share them in English.